Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. So I get asked tons of questions all the time about champion select, about, which champ should I be blinding? When should I be countering? What's the best to pick with certain team comps? Should I be dodging games? Just all general stuff about champ select that I feel like no one's ever really done a video on. So this is kind of going to be a more unplanned video, I suppose. I'm just going to kind of talk through what I think is valuable in champ select, as well as some of the philosophies I have, and maybe just explain a little bit about what I think of it. So I think the first thing to do is kind of just go through some examples I have here from my stream and just kind of talk a little bit about what I'm focusing on. So obviously the most important thing that I think goes without saying is that comfort is a factor, right? Like naturally, no one plays literally every champ in the game. And for a lot of you that are watching my videos, you probably play, 2 to 4 champs or maybe less, maybe more. But I think that, comfort is the most important thing. If you're playing a champ in rank that you haven't played before, I generally wouldn't recommend that. I think just play it on a Smurf. But with that out of the way, what's the first thing I'm thinking? So I think the most important thing in champ select is probably damage balance. So just making sure you don't have a full AD or a full AP team. If you see a team comp like this already, and you've got, say, Kiana, Samira, your sports hovering Nautilus, and your top laner, well, you don't know what they're going to play. I think you just have to play an AP champ here. Pretty much most of the time. I mean, that's just going to make sure that you don't have too much AD on your team. If you pick an AD champ here, you are kind of relying on your top laner to pick an AP, and that doesn't look like a good idea, especially into, a champ like Nunu that can build tank, and obviously Graves has a lot of armor as well. So I think damage balance, making sure you have it doesn't even have to be a good mix. It literally just means not having full AD and not having full AP. I think that's very important. I guess kind of a bonus on that is it's if you can, and again, this is like lower on the list, but if you can, it's good to play a different damage type from your jungler. So if your jungler is playing AD, you can play AP. And if your jungler is playing AP, then you play AD. And the reason that's quite valuable is because it means that, well, if you're double AP, for example, the enemy mid can rush Merc Treads really easily, or they can rush Hex Drinker, and both of those items are really, really tough. And the annoying thing about that is it's accessible by everyone. Obviously, the Hex Drinker is not, but, any champ can build Mercs early, and that makes, just playing your double AP really, really tough, because they're going to have the magic resist. A lot of the time, AP champs have CC, and so them having the tenacity on top of that, it's making things really tough, right? Also, if you're double AD, you might find that they do stuff like rush out Zhonya's, or they might build Seekers, or just in general, doubling up on the damage type. You can do it, right? Like there are certain combos, like if you say play like Maokai jungle with an AP mid, most of the time that's fine, but there are definitely certain combos that you'd want to avoid. Like if you had something like Evelyn jungle that they're already definitely going to build magic resist versus, or Karthus jungle would be another one, you really, really don't want to play an AP mid with that. You'd get a much more value out of AD. But we'll kind of talk about mid jungle a bit more later on. But just to kind of recap so far, so we've got comfort is number one. Second behind that is the damage balance. Probably the next thing I think about that immediately is, do I need mobility? And I'm going to show you two examples here. So in this example here, right, I'm last picking, and I'll go through every example once we've done everything, but let's just focus on this from a purely do I need mobility point of view, right? So we look at the enemy team and it's like, okay, Lilia, I don't think Lilia really demands you have mobility against it. It's an annoying champ for sure, but it's not super threatening. But then you look at champs like Renekton, Rakan, and Akali. If you don't have a dash versus these champs, you're going to have to play very, very safe. And I think that's something that people forget about, is that yes, you can play around these champs as an immobile champ, for sure, but it's going to require you to play so far back that you're not really going to be pressuring as much as you'd like. And at least for me, the way I try and play League is I try and play as aggressively as possible at all times. So if I know that by playing a champ without a dash here, that I'm going to not be able to play aggressive, then I'm already kind of thinking like, I don't really want to play in a mobile champ, right? And so if I compare that to an example like this, where I ended up playing Syndra, if you look at this team's threat, right, it's like, okay, Milio, range support, no threat at all. Vayne, short range, not a threat at all. Kayn, I mean, Kayn can be annoying if he gets fed, but honestly, I don't really consider Kayn much of a threat. I think Kayn is, for the most part, just a power farming jungler. Not really scared about it at all. Ziggs, again, virtually no threat, no CC, very easy to deal with. Aurelia is really the only threatening champ on the team. So if you compare this game to the one previously, it's much easier to play a champ that is more immobile or doesn't have a dash in this game. Now, obviously, Syndra has some self-peel, right? Like, she has her E, which is, it is relevant, of course, especially against shorter range champs like Aurelia or Vayne. The E can be used against them really, really well. But I think if you were to play Syndra in this game here, you would have you could play this out, right? Like I think the Akali matchup's not the best, but it can work. And like if you save stun for Rakan and Renekton, you can probably make it work. But I think just like if you can play a champ with a dash here, it would feel a lot better just because that way you don't have to say hold your E defensively. You can still use it aggressively and not be so worried about getting engaged on as a result. So yeah, I think having mobility is really important against comps that kind of show a lot of threat. Next thing though, I guess I would choose for matchup. So once we've kind of thought about damage balance, we've thought about, do we need mobility? What is actually good against the matchup? So let's take this game here, right? And if we go through them. So first off, damage balance. AD or AP, I could probably play either. I think AD champ is preferable because I have an Elise jungle, and they probably will build Mercs against Ashe. So if I can play an AD champ here, it is preferable. But, remember that comfort is a factor. And I would say in general, I have more AP champs that I can play than AD champs. So I might pick an AD if it's a good game for it, but I'm more likely to pick an AP. Do I need mobility? I think we've answered yes. And so it's okay. Like what champs do well into Akali that have that mobility? I think Corki is one that's kind of a surprise. I think Corki does pretty well into Akali. She can punish the range early. He has mobility. And so that could be an option, right? Another one we could go is something like LeBlanc. Like LeBlanc has good matchup again into Akali. It's got dashes against these champs. That could be good. Ahri is a champ that we can consider for pretty much same reasons. Has mobility, has some CC, decent lane into Akali. So now we've got some options, right? We've got those three that we're kind of thinking about. So then we go to the next step of like what is actually best with the junglers, right? So we've factored in our lane. Next, we're going to factor in the junglers. So they have Lilia. A good way to punish Lilia is if you have priority and can invade her jungle. So ideally, I want to pick something that has priority. If I can't get priority, that's fine, but that would be a possibility. More important though is your own jungler, and I have Elise. So Elise is a champ that wants to be able to pressure. She really wants to be able to gank. If you have CC, it makes Elise's job a lot easier. So if you remember before, we're thinking Corki, Ahri, or LeBlanc. You would not want to play Corki with Elise. While there is an argument, perhaps, that if you have Corki with Elise, Elise can help you kind of get through your weak early game, I think it just doesn't really play to your strengths, right? Like, I think Corki would much prefer a beefier tank in front of him, and I think Elise would much prefer a champion with gank setup. So I would say if you ended up picking the Corki here, even though it's like a good matchup, and even though it kind of ticks all the other boxes, it sort of trolls your Elise, and I wouldn't be a huge fan of that. So I believe what I ended up picking here was LeBlanc. And again, the reason is good into Akali. It's good with Elise. I think it does get priority, so I can invade Lilia. It's got dashes versus these champs, and I can play AP or AD this game. Now, if you can play any champ in the game, right? Like if I were extremely good at every champ, what would I play here? What would be a good AD with CC? I mean, Renekton could probably be good, but they've picked it, so that could be a champ we could think about. Maybe something like Cassante could be good as well. So I think Cassante has CC for Elise. It's very tanky versus Akali. So that could be something else as well, right? Like I'm not going to come out here and say that I can play every champ in the game because I can't. I can play most mids, but the reality is there are some I don't, and especially champs that are kind of more like off-roll champs, right? Like something like Cassante that's primarily a top but can be played mid, I'd say I'm not super good at. So that would be kind of I guess almost like our checklist of stuff for the most part, right? Like I think that goes all the way down to, I guess, again, to reiterate it, we've got the comfort, the damage balance, the mobility, think about our lane, think about their lane. And I guess the last thing you're starting to think about now is like what deals well into their comp. And I would say that generally comp is the last thing I pick or I think about. And that's not because that's not important, but it's because the other things are just more important, right? So like if we come to a game, like what's some other examples here? What have I got? Maybe a game like this could be an example, right? So picking like for comp and against comp can go a pretty long way. And like this game here, I have double poke champs already. I have a Nidalee, and this was the patch when AP Kai'Sa bot lane was really strong. So I have like double poke already. Also, they have very little engage. Like if you look at this, they have a range support. So they're lacking, a Nautilus or a Rao or something like that. And other than that, like what are their pick tools? I mean, they could ult us with Yone, they could chain us with LeBlanc, but that's it. I mean, this is a comp with very, very low threat. And if we just pick a lot of range, I can not only synergize with my Nidalee and Kai'Sa and just build a ton of poke, but also I can just play a really long range champ against a comp that is made to punish short range, right? Like Vayne is good for short range, Janna is good for short range, even LeBlanc is like kind of better for short range, Kindred of course as well. So this is a champ, this is a comp that is heavily countered by range, and also range plays really well into our comp. So if we were kind of to go down the checklist again, with this as an example, right? It's like, okay, I have Damage balance first, right? I have like 2 AP champs. I should probably play an AD, so I go with Jace. Next thing is, what was the next thing on my list? I need to check again. Oh, next thing is, do I need mobility? I think there's an argument that you could. They have LeBlanc Kindred, which is a scary combo, but they have like a range support, so it's not like they have a Nautilus. I think if you had a dash in this game, it would be nice, but I think you can get away with it. So up to you. Next thing is obviously thinking about like our matchup and the junglers. So Jace is a good 1v1 into LeBlanc. If it kind of depends, right? It depends a lot on who gets items first, because like this was back with Shiv LeBlanc, and Shiv LeBlanc is quite strong in lane. But if you manage to get a Dirk on Jace early, then you actually win. So I was happy picking this as a matchup, but maybe you guys wouldn't be. And then obviously with the junglers, so I will say that I don't think, while Jace is very good with Nidalee when it comes to mid game, it's not super good for the early game. So generally, Nidalee wants CC and push, so Jace at least brings push, but he doesn't bring any CC. So something like Renekton obviously is commonly paired with Nidalee for those reasons. So I guess, is Jace the perfect pick in this game? I suppose just for literally everything, I would say no, but I think it's pretty damn good, right? I think like decent matchup, like it's really good without comp, it's really good versus their comp, and I think I don't really need like a dash or anything like that. So that's kind of how I got to this pick here. So I think what we'll do now is, before we go to the, like, before I kind of talk about my philosophies and maybe talk a bit about some example drafts, I'm just going to go through all the ones that I haven't so far and just kind of talk about anything I kind of wanted to bring up. So real quick, I wanted to mention here, I was picking AP here, obviously, but I think I also need a dash. So reason was, they have Nunu, which is really, really good at ganking, and they have Kai'Sa, who's probably going to be paired with a melee support. So chances are that this is like Nunu, good ganking champ with like Nautilus or Rel or Leona. I think if you don't have a dash in that case, it's going to be really, really hard to play mid. And that can be problematic because the champs that do best against Graves are a lot of kind of like short range mages, or some long range mages too, but generally AP champs that are immobile, right? Like I think good champs for Graves and stuff like Cassio is good. I think Syndra is quite good. Orianna is good. So these champs that do very well are probably not champs that I'd want to play into Graves mid, just because I know that it's going to be ganking jungle and support. So what I might be thinking instead is like, I think you can see it hovering here. They ended up going Ahri, because Ahri can at least match the push while also having some mobility. So you can see there's kind of like a lot to think about if you really get into it. But remember, it's like a priority system of like, I think if you can at least make sure your damage balance is good and you have mobility if you need it, I think that's like the most important things, right? If you can get some extras, that's great. But hey, we're fine with that. Talked about this one already, talked about this one already. Okay, so here's another one. And I'll talk about this a bit when I talk about blind picking as a whole. I have already done a blind pick tier list of which champs I think are good to blind, but I think like generally if you can blind champs that do have like a really, yeah, they're just like really good into anything. I kind of want to save this one just for a bit because I want to talk about blind picking kind of as a philosophy. But yeah, for now, I think just like first pick blind picking Azir here is a decent choice because has mobility, does well in most lanes, it's a strong champ, and does well against most comps. So it's kind of like giving us a decent chance to carry the game pretty much no matter what happens. This one here, I don't really think I've talked about. So here is one that I think isn't as obvious, I suppose. So this was weird because they had Bard support and Rakan jungles. So that's kind of like two gang setup champs. And they also have an Echo mid. So Echo is a champ that you want to punish in lane because he's kind of weak in lane. But this is a really strong 3v3, and I think you probably do want a dash in this game. Again, like you've got a talent, so you kind of want to get stuck in for some 2v2s. So I kind of want something aggressive, but also something that can survive ganks. So again, we're maybe looking at something like LeBlanc or Azir or Ahri. You could probably get away without a dash. Like if you played something like Vex and you use your W well, I think you'd be okay. Or maybe Talia as well. Like there are some champs without dashes that have enough self-peel that you can probably make it work. But I think I would prefer a dash. But again, up to you. This game here, so this is one where they showed very, very low threat. I believe I actually ended up picking Cassio in this game from what I remember. I don't quite remember, but it was like, okay, so they'd shown Tristana already. Tristana mid is countered by Cassio, so that's really good. Cassio is also very, very good with Rek'Sai because Rek'Sai can knock them up. You follow up with the W, so that's really good as well. Cassio obviously good with Twitch. And then, you know, Thresh gets picked. I think Thresh is one of the easier melee supports to play against because his ganks are pretty telegraphed. Like, I'd say the hook is a lot easier to dodge than something like Hook or Leona Engage or, you know, just any of that sort of thing. I think it's a lot easier, in my opinion at least, to play against the Thresh than to play against those. Talked about this one already. Oh yeah, and then this one here. So this was another one, and you can see I'm picking Azir a lot. And the reason is he's very high on my blind pick tier list. In this game, I hadn't seen, or I had seen the mid matchup, which was Lucian. This ended up being Zac top. And I can't remember what their jungler was. I'm pretty sure it was something really low threat. So if I'd seen like Lucian and a low threat jungle, like if I saw Lucian Lilia, I could say, you could say, play basically whatever you want, right? Like as long as it beats Lucian in lane, you've got like no threat from Janet, no threat from the Lilia, and then you'd be completely fine. But that wasn't the case here. So I needed a champ that did well against Lucian, could play against what I thought at the time was a ganking jungler. And Zac is quite a hard champ for immobile mages to play against. So in this game, you're probably thinking something like, well, I ended up going Azir, but I think you could play something like Zed. You could play something... actually, probably not Zed. So we need AP. That's another thing. Maybe we could play something like Vlad, although it doesn't do that well into Lucian. We could play Ahri. I think the matchup is fine. We could play LeBlanc. We have a jungler that can gank. I think LeBlanc would be better if we had a ganking support. So yeah, these are kind of just the things I'm thinking about as a whole. Okay, so with all the examples out of the way, let me just talk about kind of blind picking, counter picking, swapping, dodging, all that stuff sort of as a philosophy. So our first one is blind picking. So for me, with blind picking, what you're trying to do is you're trying to give yourself the best chance to carry the game in terms of a percentage, not in terms of winning every game, because that's something I see all the time. Of people will play, say, a good blind pick like Ahri, and Ahri is good because she's incredibly well-rounded, but she's not good at carrying literally every single game because she's not as hard a 1v9 champ as, you know, some of the assassins or something like that. And that's just not that important. The reality is that not every game is winnable, and you're not really looking to I don't know, you're not really looking for 100% win rate, you're more looking for 60 or 70% or something like that, right? So I generally think that picking well-rounded champs is better because it's going to be more useful against more comps and more matchups. Whereas I think if you pick something like, let's say you just psycho pick something and you first pick like Aurelia, like that's going to give you a chance to there will probably be some games that you can 1v9 on a champ like Aurelia that you couldn't on a champ like Ahri, but there's also going to be some games that are going to be very, very difficult because they've got, you know, they're bad comps, or you're in a really bad matchup or something like that, or your team picks all AD. So there's going to be things, I guess, that make it difficult. So that's number one with blind picking, is just making sure that overall is giving yourself like that really solid chance to play the game. Some other things I kind of see people talk about when they're blinding is, you know, should I just blind like really greedy scaling and just try and like play better than my opponent and say that if I don't get punished in lane that I'll outscale and carry? So that's kind of one approach people take is, you know, let's say they blind a champ like Corki and they're saying, okay, if I don't get punished early, if nothing happens, I will just outscale and destroy my opponent. So going for the blind pick greedy scaling, personally, I don't really like it. I actually used to like it quite a lot, but I think the way the game goes now, it's just too fast-paced and too much happens early. A lot of the time, even though a game goes to say 30 minutes, it's not completely decided, but it's in one team's like heavy favor by around 15 minutes. So I think just blinding some really greedy scaling, and then it's like if you verse a bad matchup and like your team doesn't play safe and fights a lot early, which is very, very likely in solo queue, I think that's like a really greedy choice, and I wouldn't really recommend it. Another thing people do is they just try and blind pick that super early aggression. So again, we used our Aurelia as an example, but let's say you just blind something like Lucian mid. You know, this is a champ that's going to win almost every single lane. The problem with this, though, is that these champs aren't as well rounded. Like they might suffer compositionally, or they might be neutralizable. You know, like if you blind a champ like, well, let's say blind a champ like Zed. Like I actually think Zed is one of the better mid blinds for sure. But there are going to be games where if they go something like, I don't know, Lissandra Kindred, like you're going to have a really tough time doing anything in that game, right? So I would say it's normally better just to pick for the best well-rounded composition, because that way it is going to give you the best chance to carry most of the games, and you're, again, to reemphasize, not worried about getting 100% win rate. You just want to have the most win rate overall. And again, I would refer to my blind pick tier list for things that are good for blinding. I've already talked about it to death, so please go check that video out. What about my approach when counterpicking then? So for me, when I get counterpicked, that's kind of like my chance to 1v9 the game. I feel really confident when I have a counterpick, and I guess obviously I factor in all the things we've already talked about already, right? Like the mid-jungle combos, the comps and stuff like that. But the main thing I'm looking for when I'm countering is I want to be able to get priority. I think that's really, really important. If I can, I want to get priority and outscale. I would say that if you have a scaling win condition, that's really nice, but don't take a scaling win condition at the cost of getting priority. So for example, if I were to choose something like, I don't know, Xerath does quite well into Lucian later on because he's so short range, but that's going to mean that I have to give up priority early. I don't really like that because I think that gives Lucian a chance to get into the game, and that's something that I don't want to give over to him. So I'm trying to, just get that priority, make sure I have a winning lane. If I can as well, I will outscale. I suppose I'm just generally, I want to make them feel like the game is just lost because they blind picked, right? Like, I'm sure you guys have felt like that before. You blind pick a champ that you probably shouldn't have. You get put in a matchup that just feels completely unplayable and you just lose off it. That's what I'm trying to give to my opponent. Obviously, sometimes it's going to be impossible, right? Like, if they choose a bunch of champs that are going to really pressure me hard, and that means, like, I can't pick as aggressively as I'd want. In a game like this, for example, I know that I can super hard counter this Graves. Like, I would love to play Cassio and just destroy him, but I'm just going to be unable to. Like, I think just they have too much gang setup coming through to be able to do that. So again, I think try and, factor in all those things I said before. And the main reason I'm bringing up this again is the critical point is make sure that you have priority and you win the lane, and if possible, outscale. But don't pick something that outscales while giving priority. I mean, you can do this, like, for example, let's say we did something like Corki into Graves. It's like, yes, the 1v1's fine. Yes, Corki is good against these champs, but it's giving Graves the opportunity to have a free lane as someone who blind picked, especially blind picking a champ that shouldn't be blinded, in my opinion. Like, Graves is a champ that should be punished. So I really, really try not to give my opponents free blinds. Next, we have swapping. So something that people ask me all the time is like, should I swap for later picks in champ select or something like that? And I guess the first thing I would say is just prioritize yourself, right? Like, if you main champions that are blind pickable, then you probably don't need to swap. But at the same time, if you main a bunch of champs that have counter picks, you should be swapping. And I will say that, let's say that I'm first picked in the draft. Normally, I will try and swap with someone later in the draft so that I can see the enemy mid pick first. And once again, that's because I'm confident that if I have the counter pick, that I'm going to be able to carry the lane, right? Or carry the game. Now, sometimes that's not going to happen. And if you're forced into, early picking, you're going to have to be able to play a blind around it. Something I see a lot in the coaching sessions that I have is, you guys might main champs like, I don't know, Yasuo. And straight up, like, Yasuo is not really a champ that's meant for blinding, right? So you should be trying to swap every game. And, it's not going to happen probably. And I probably would advise you to learn a blind pick champ as well. But sometimes that's just going to be the way it goes. You're going to have to be able to play both and able to swap. I guess one thing you might have as a question is, what if you can play both blinds and counterpicks? Again, which one do you prefer? So I think a misconception people have is that if you blind pick, in theory, that means your teammates are the one countering, right? Like, they will see, let's just say we see some like bot lane champs or whatever. I'm just going to click random things. And then, you can just like 4-5, whatever you want. In theory, okay, this wouldn't be a good counter, but you know what I'm saying, right? Is in theory, your team would see their champs first, and then they would get to counter. And so it's like, if you go even mid, your team should carry, right? And I think that's like a really bad mindset, because I think that in solo queue, people don't use counter picks very well. Like, they don't know what to pick. And even then, they don't know how to play the matchup, right? So I think if you're blinding for the sake of being like, okay, all I need to do is not lose and my teammates will carry, I think that's the wrong mentality. You're blinding because essentially, like, you haven't swapped, or because you're fine to still carry the game while blind picking. I don't think you should have the mindset of, I'm blind picking so my team needs to carry me. And again, like, I think if you can counter, it's generally gonna be better, because if you're someone that can use your counter pick in a positive way, that's gonna be much better than someone who's just like picking champs randomly. Normally I do try and swap with like AD or supports, because I think AD and support counter pick at the moment, not particularly viable, right? Like, AD meta is like Kai'Sa, Xayah, Zeri, and then support meta is like pretty much just a bunch of melee supports. I generally don't swap with top laners. I think top lane counter is more important. You can swap with junglers as well if you want, but I think, at least from my point of view, mid and top counter picks are the most important in solo queue at the moment, but that can be meta dependent. But again, I'm completely fine to blind. Like, I'm willing to blind champs like Azir and stuff like that. So yeah, just be willing to swap around if you want. If you can pick later on in the draft, that's always nice. If you've already seen the enemy mid, you might as well swap. Like, let's say they pick Akali here, you might as well swap and try and pick here, because you want your team to have a good chance, right? Like, I think it's better to pick early and have a good matchup, even if you don't see their whole comp, just to give your team a chance to pick some matchups, right? Like, if they see Ezreal here, maybe they can go some really greedy bot laner like Karthus or something. That could be an example. So the very last thing I want to talk about is dodging. So it's unfortunate that dodging is such a powerful tool that you kind of, it's hard to ignore. I think it's too strong, and I would prefer if Riot remove dodging. But I think while it's in the game, it doesn't make sense to not abuse it. So, Generally, my approach to dodging is I dodge when I know the game is going to be really difficult, again, for me to carry. I don't often factor my teammates too much into that. Like, obviously it's harder now because of anonymous champ select, but even before, I didn't really factor in my teammates too much. I mainly just looked at the game and was like, okay, is this going to be a hard game for me to carry? So let's kind of, do an example. Let's say I like blind pick Ahri mid, right? And then okay, maybe they pick a difficult matchup into me. So what could be a difficult matchup? Maybe something like Lux. This is not something that I can really make any headway into. I can farm and I can probably like pick Lux in the mid game, so it's fine, but it's not really something I'm going to be able to take huge advantage of, right? Compared to, let's say they picked a really easy matchup and I could just destroy it. Like, what would be an example? Like, let's say they'd picked, I don't know, like, what's an example? I mean, maybe Ahri's a bad example because she's more mid into most champs, but like, let's say they pick something like Silas, right? Generally in solo queue, obviously it's a good Silas, it can be hard, but a lot of the time as Ahri, I'll be very confident that I'll just like really hard win lane against Silas, right? Like, because they're just not very good, I take Ignite and I easily kill them. Now, what happens if my team kind of picks some not troll champs, but champs that don't really go well around me? So let's say my jungler picks Sedge. So first off, Ahri Sedge, not a great combo. It means Merc Tread's value is really high, it's double AP, and it means that, Sedge is, I don't know, she's not much of a ganking champ, right? Like, Ahri is very, very good with champs like Lee or Rek'Sai or Xin Zhao or Kindred or Graves, just champs that either bring damage or bring like even more CC. But Sedge is like kind of a tank jungler that pairs best with melee. So this is already like kind of an average game for me, right? Like, I'm playing Ahri into Silas. It's like good. Let's take away this again and make it something more difficult. Let's say it's like Ahri versus, I don't know, Annie. Like, again, a champ that you're not going to be able to make much headway into 1v1. So it's like, okay, we don't have a great mid jungle, don't also have a great lane. Let's say then that we keep going down the draft and it's like our support picks something like maybe something like Yuumi. So Ahri Yuumi is actually a good combo. Like, I like playing Ahri with Yuumi, but like, again, when you're playing Ahri versus Annie, like in a mobile mage, what you want is to be able to pressure her. So if this was, Sejuani Yuumi, two champs that are probably not going to pressure mid, and the Merc Tread's value is insanely high, compared to, like, let's say if this were like Rek'Sai Nautilus, like, suddenly that's looking a lot better, even though I have like a sort of bad matchup. And then what if in 4-5 we went something like Gwen, I think without even seeing my ADC, I would already very highly consider dodging this game because, like, we have tons of AP. I don't have a good mid jungle combo. I don't have like a particularly good lane, and I know that this is a game that's going to be hard for me to carry. Now, it's very possible that my Gwen just super 1v9s, right? Like, we could go into the game and it could be that, I don't know, whatever champ this is, like maybe it's a Renekton. Like, Renekton ends up getting hard destroyed by Gwen. She goes like 15-0 and it's not a problem, right? But the thing is, because we're playing for percentages, you're like the most common factor, right? So making sure that you can carry is the most important thing. So if you saw, I don't know, what are some other champs that are difficult for Ahri? I don't know, let's say this was like Zyra Rakan. Like, Xayah is pretty hard for Ahri to pressure because Xayah can often take cleanse, Xayah has ulti, and also she just ends up really strong, and obviously Rakan for CC. And then let's say they went something like Rel jungle. I mean, this is an insane amount of CC. Their comp just looks disgustingly broken, and it's going to be, I just see it as like a really, really difficult game for me to carry. So I would probably dodge. Now, how often do I dodge? I would say not that often. I probably dodge one in maybe every 10 games or so. It could be a little less, could be a little more. Again, I'm just like trying to look for the times where I'm like, okay, I know this game is going to be unplayable. Something someone sent me on Discord recently is they were playing Syndra, right? And they were up against like Zed Evelyn. So this is, you could say, okay, maybe you shouldn't have picked Syndra here as a start, right? Like, Syndra is decently blindable, but if there's something to punish it, it's probably this. And then it's like, okay, there are ways to deal with this, right? Like, I think if you take probably what, like Ignite Airy, you can do well into Zed. Maybe once you get Zhonya's, you can do well into these. But I would say this is a game I think about dodging. Now, another thing I'm going to quickly say is you do need to be careful with this, because if you dodge too much, you're just not gonna be able to play these situations out if you're forced to, right? Like, some kind of like experiment I like to do with myself sometimes is, I think, okay, chances are this is unplayable. Like, I look at it and it's going to be super difficult, but if I had to play it out, like, what would I do? There's almost always a ton of things you can do, even as a challenger player, that you're probably not doing to make things easier. So again, like, if you looked at this game here, and I'll say that the person I looked at on Discord with the screenshot, you know, they had like TP first strike or something. And so it's like, okay, first thing, we probably need a combat sum, whether it's Ignite or Barrier, maybe even Cleanse for the Z, Ignite or Evelyn Charm, right? So we need something. Then we might want a different keystone. Like I think first strike is not going to be very good for this combo. It might be that you need to rush a defensive item first. It might be that you need to keep the wave on your side all the time. You might need to, you know, make sure you drop really good wards in their jungle or something, right? So there probably are ways to dealing with this, and maybe it's too difficult, right? Like I was saying, if it's a game that's going to be super hard for you to carry, you should probably dodge, but at the same time, there's always going to be things that you could do better. And I don't want you guys to look at this and be like, okay, there was nothing I can do. I was counted in champ select, so I'm not going to try learn from it. I think that's really, really poor mindset, and I think that like holds you back a lot. So I would try not to do that. I think that's going to be basically it for this video, though. Hopefully I did kind of clear things up, and you know, champ select is something that I think is a lot harder to find examples of, I suppose. You know, I just took some random screenshots from my stream. Again, twitch.tv/shoklol, if you guys haven't checked it out. But hopefully it did kind of make sense. So I guess to reiterate the main points, I think the checklist thing is the most important, right? So I'll just read it out again. I have it written here. So comfort, obviously really, really nice. The damage balance, mobility, you know, what's good for my matchup, what's good for my jungle supports. And very lastly, like thinking about the team comps. Now, if you guys do want, of course, ask me questions in the comments. If in future you guys would like to see something more about comps in general, like maybe that as a specific video, or even just like mid-jungle combinations, mid-jungle support combinations, I think that could definitely be a video. So let me guys know, I guess, what you wanted to see and what was missing from this video, because again, it's not really something that I scripted out too much, because I've never really like thought about putting my thoughts on champ select down before, and also I don't think anyone else has really made a video on it either. So that's kind of my thoughts. Remember, this does apply for solo queue mainly. Competitive is very different, but hopefully it was helpful for you guys. If you did like the video, go ahead and like and subscribe. I'll see you guys next time.